Good morning, good morning. When we were doing the research for the cannabis section, I came upon that rather droll video in which Pierre Burton taught everybody how to roll a joint. I was reminded that in 1966, Pierre, who was then at the height of his fame and his influence, had published a book called The Comfortable Pew. And it was a review of the state of religion, organized religion, mainstream religion in Canada at the time, and it hit like a thunderbolt because it was really the first time, or among the first times, that people had begun to acknowledge that the kind of portrait of Canada that had existed up to the Second World War, a sleepy colony, mostly of the UK, of England, had begun to change and begun to change radically, and with it, the faith habits of the population. And in preparing this session, which is sponsored by Vision, Vision is Canada's multi-faith, Zoomer-oriented television network. That's significant because whatever other religious broadcasting there is in our country at this time is tending more and more towards single faith broadcasters. And in that sense, is mimicking a little bit those silos that we have talked about that have developed on the internet and have created the kind of more divided society that we have and that we are currently deploring. So Vision is meant to be an expression of the meeting place where the races and the religions can meet and with luck find some kind of comedy and some kind of collaboration, which is, I think we all agree, the essence of Canada. So in planning this session, I thought it'd be interesting to look in again on the Comfortable Pew and see what had become of those developments given what had happened in the intervening years, notably immigration. Immigration had had a huge impact on the spiritual practices of Canadian citizens, and I wanted to get to the hard numbers of that, and it turns out that Ray Pennings had done just that. He had done that as a Canada 150 project. 2017, last year, I've asked him to come here and to report to us on the state of religion in Canada in 2018. Ray. Good to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. As Moses mentioned, I've been invited to talk about religion in Canada. And one of the questions we asked on our poll was, do you feel comfortable around religiously devout people? And 50% of Canadians said no, they did not. So I'm here with a bit of a warning right up front that if you're part of that 50%, I'm here to report that religion is perhaps a little more ubiquitous and wide-ranging in Canada than most people think. So for some of us, that may be a finding that makes us a bit squeamish. Before we get into the heart of the numbers, a couple of words about what we mean when we're talking about religion. First of all, nobody really checks the box religion. It's a category we use to talk about the deeply held beliefs that people have, their own answers to the why questions, if you will. Why am I here? What am I doing here? Where am I going? Why does this all matter? And yet, religious people disagree as much with each other as they do with those who would not describe themselves as religious. And so when we talk about the category of religion, it's important that people think of themselves as Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Jew, with their own particularities, and they have as much difference with each other. So religion as a category is something that's convenient to talk about, but we have to be careful in terms of its own meaning. Secondly, we need to respect the fact that for religious people, it's at the core of their identity. Religion matters to them. We need to treat it and them with respect. Again, it's widely different. I'm here, I'm a confessing Christian. That means I believe the Apostles' Creed. It means I believe that 2,000 years ago there was a historical person who was born of a virgin, who died, and who is now alive again. I understand that matching that belief with science and scientific evidence and asking exactly how all of those things happen make very little sense to those who don't share my faith. And so it is with almost all faiths. People believe stuff that to those on the outside of that faith community seem weird. And yet it's very real to them. Thirdly, I think it is also very important to note regarding religion that it has an effect on people that either bring them together or divide them apart. And so it's been throughout human history. Religion acts both as a glue, but also as a dividing point. To Canadianize it and put a red-green, it can either be the duct tape that binds awkward things together, or it can be the chainsaw that's used for nefarious purposes. But religion has that sort of effect. So, where are we as Canada in 2017 in terms of our religious makeup and our religious identity? The common narrative about religion has a picture of decline. The assumption has been that as people get more and more educated, religion will go down proportionately. And if you want to find data to reinforce that, it's not hard to do so. Church attendance, even in the last 15 years, has gone down, once a month, has gone down very significantly. And if we put a longer trajectory on that, you'll see that since the 60s, Canadians going to church has decreased rather significantly. And so the common narrative about religion is that it is on the decline. Now, that's nothing new. Already a few centuries ago, Voltaire was predicting the end of religion, and there has been a veritable list of leading Western philosophers and academics who have reinforced the notion and the belief that religion inevitably will decline with the advance of science and with knowledge. And yet, when you take a look at the data, that doesn't really seem to be the case. In the US, there are some significant, and other parts of the world, there are some significant data collection exercises that happen on a regular basis. In Canada, there was none. So the think tank that I co-founded partnered last year with the Angus Reid Institute. We went into the field 3 times with very extensive polls. All the data I'm going to show you is from that. These are representative Canadian samples of between 1,500 and 2,300. All of the detailed breakdowns are on the website. You can follow through and look at the data in great detail if you want. Obviously, in my time, I can only summarize. What we did is rather than ask people about which religion do you believe or what do you believe, we wanted to understand the impact that faith had on our shared life together. So we came up with 7 factors. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Do you pray? Do you read the Bible? Do you educate your children in a religious tradition? Do you participate in a community of worship? So we took these 7 factors, and basically, if you had 0 or 1 of them, you were categorized as a non-believer. If you had 6 or 7 of them, you were religiously committed. And then obviously in the middle was 3 or 4 being privately faithful. So this is regardless of what religion you are, we're asking about people and their own practices. What's interesting is the result produced almost a perfect bell curve, roughly 20% on either side, roughly 60% in the middle. And it so happened, and we were in the field 3 times, 3 separate samples, and all within the margin of error produced roughly this sort of picture in terms of where Canadians are at. Now, data always begs interpretation. If you want the narrative of decline, you can say, well, there's only 20% religiously committed people, so 80% aren't. That, indeed, is true. If, on the other hand, you are really wanting to emphasize the influence of religion, you say 80% of Canadians participate in at least 3 or 4 of these practices. They pray, they do something religious, they experience God. So therefore, we are very religious. The fact is, the data is nuanced, and there are various things to be taken from this data. It's interesting when you look at the data of decline. Yes, religious attendance in churches is going down. At the same time, when you ask people about their own experience, who go to church, about their own experience of congregational life, you'll notice that people are going to churches that are at least staying the same or growing for the most part. And the number of churches themselves that are declining is shrinking. So the nature of where people are worshiping is changing. The bottom line is, in all of this, is that what the narrative of decline, the sense that religion isn't going away, simply is not viably supported by the data. So that doesn't mean religion doesn't have a brand problem. When you ask people about the word religion, born again, evangelical, all religious jargon, you tend to get pretty negative responses. People are fairly negative about the words relating to religion. But as you look at this slide, notice the fact that different segments of the population respond very differently to those words. Averages are really, it's like the river, right? If most of it's 12 feet deep, a bit of it is 1 foot deep, the average is 6. But nowhere is it 6 feet. That's very much when it comes to religious. These averages, cumulatively, don't really tell the nuanced story because the 4 groups in Canada experience these terms very, very differently. What is interesting when we take a look at this mindset of religion, this bell curve, when we looked at the data, and we're in the field actually right now looking at some further data on how new Canadians compare to first generation, second generation, and third generation. We're hoping to come out with that in a couple of weeks' time. But based on the data last year, what was clear is that the middle was shrinking. We are, among younger people especially, those under 35, and among new Canadians, we are seeing more participation in religious and more, they're fitting more of the categories or they're fitting less. They're either embracing it wholeheartedly or they're rejecting it outright. So the middle is shrinking somewhat if you take a look, especially in terms of new Canadians and immigrants. But what does this mean in day-to-day life? Some of the results here might surprise you. We asked about funding for for government funding for religious schools. 80% of Canadians support full or partial funding. Something that probably surprises most of us. Canadian views on the relevance of religious community. Are they becoming less relevant or are they become as relevant as ever? 50-50. When we ask Canadians, what's the most important things in life? What is interesting is those who are religiously committed by far value family life, honesty, concern for others. Many of the characteristics, and there's a whole pile more in the data, I'd encourage you, many of the characteristics that people look at and say, this is the good life, this is what flourishing looks like, you'll find that much more on one side of the spectrum than on the other, and also in terms of happiness outcomes. What about involvement with their communities? Here's where the rubber really hits the road. 83% of those who are on the religious side of the spectrum are very heavily involved in their community. Half of those on the non-religious spectrum are not. There is an otherness, a we-ness about being involved in religious communities that doesn't just extend to their own communities, it extends to their neighborhoods and the broader group. This is true in volunteering. It's also true in terms of donations. 2010, I wrote a study based on some StatsCan data, suggested 29% of Canadians supply 83% of all the charitable donations in Canada. 23 out of those 29% were actively involved in their community of worship. It's coming very much from one side of that spectrum. So Canadians are involved. They're interested in these things on the front line, and yet there's this narrative of decline. So why is that? Let me suggest very quickly 2 items: amnesia and antagonism. We asked a whole series, and I'm just showing one slide here, there's about 10 of these on the website. What about faith communities in hospitals, homes for the elderly? When you see their negatives, they're very minor. Most people say this is a good thing. Just down the street, we have Mount Sinai Hospital, started in 1913 by the Jewish community. They raised the original funds. They built the original infrastructure. But even today, hundreds of millions of dollars are being raised by the Sinai Foundation, a charitable foundation, not just to help the Jewish community, but to help all of us. It's part of our healthcare system. But even more remarkable than the positive aspect of this is the amnesia aspect. Between 1 out of 5 and 1 out of 3 Canadians, when you ask them these sorts of questions, say, I don't know. I'm not aware of any involvement of religious communities in the delivery of the day-to-day services that we take for granted here in Canada. So there's a problem of amnesia. But I'd suggest there's a little more than that going on here. McGill philosopher Charles Taylor, a few years ago, wrote a 875-page tome called Our Secular Age, won him a Templeton Prize. It's not really the sort of book that's given the quick summary here, so let me use my own metaphors to try to get at what I think Taylor was saying. He said, the word secular has changed in its meaning. Originally, secular was sort of a description of geography. The priest had a sacred vocation, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker had secular vocations. As we moved into the modern era, secular came to mean neutral. It meant that we don't pick favorites among different religions. It's a neutral space. Taylor suggests that we're moving to a third definition of secularism today, and that is what he calls a closed secularism. It's a secularism that chooses non-religion over religion. So it's no longer neutral. It actually is taking neutrality as a religion, as a mind in itself, and minimizing and marginalizing perspectives like those of faith. We see lots of examples of that in our society. In many ways, it's almost a bumper sticker. We quickly say separation of church and state. And yet, we ignore the fact that so many of our services depend on the participation of not only religious individuals, but also religious communities. It's one of the projects we have at Cardis is we replicated a University of Pennsylvania study, and we looked at, you can look it up on your phones at haloproject.ca. You can type in your own city, and it will look at the number of religious institutions in your city and what the replacement costs for the goods and services they provide. Montreal, there's just over 800 religious institutions. It would if they would all close tomorrow, it would cost over $2 billion to the taxpayer to replace the services that they are providing. This nature of marginalization of religion, this closed secularism, is finding its ways. I don't have time. Last week there was a very significant decision rendered by our Supreme Court of Canada. Chief Justice McLaughlin, although she sided with the majority on that decision, it involved whether or not equality rights or religious rights should have priority in the case of Trinity Western University and its law school. Even though she sided with the majority, Justice McLaughlin wrote, "With respect, I cannot agree that the decision on the freedom of religion of members of the Trinity Western Unity community is of minor significance. We are dealing with some major questions right now that's reframing how we understand religion in public life." And so, one of the things we did is we asked Canadians to say, what do you think of various religious groups? Are they a net benefit or are they net damaging to Canadian society? What's interesting, if you take a look at the 8 groups that we asked, when it comes to Catholics, Protestants of various types, Jewish religions, there's a net positive. When it comes to Hinduism and atheism, within the margin of error, they're 50-50. There are 2 groups in Canada which have very negative ratings, the Sikh community and the Muslim community. Now, obviously, we all understand the challenges that those communities have faced in some of the history and their associations with security issues. But I ask the question, is the fact of these findings also something about a growing these are two groups that wear their religion very publicly. You can immediately identify members of those community. What does it say about our tolerance in Canada when we have these sorts of findings? What's very interesting is if you parse the numbers, those who are religious themselves are far more tolerant. They follow some of these same, but they are far more tolerant. Those who are on the non-religious side are 4 times as likely to be negative towards every other group except atheists. So, my time is up. Canada is a picture in which religious communities are everywhere. They're ubiquitous in our own life. They're part of our architecture. They've been part of our history. Canada has been a country in which the founding of it was a deal between French Catholics and English Protestants who thought each other were going to hell, but decided to live together, support minority education for each other, and be a model of tolerance. I would suggest that we're losing our history and our data as we implement a closed secular framework, which is a very real problem on our way forward. We're a country founded on principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law in our Constitution. There's a challenge for us to take that seriously and continue to make Canada glorious and free. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was excellent.